Well, it's 3:18, so we'll get started because time is tight for all of us. Welcome to our second webinar with Rick Masters. Rick Masters is special counsel for the National Center for Interstate Compacts. He works closely with a number of the compacts in our country and has been great support to REPLICA as we get on our feet and are heading towards our inaugural meeting and first year as an Interstate Commission for EMS personnel practice. Today's focus is on transitional administrative and operational issues, some food for thought. And just for some ground rules to start off, everybody is muted. And from here, if I see you raise your hand or chat a question, I'll be sure and take care of it and get you into the pipeline, which will either be unmute you or take your written question and make sure we get a response from Rick. Does anybody have any questions as we get started? Rick, are you all set?
Yes.
Okay, great. I see a hello out there. Just quickly, again, our inaugural meeting is coming up on October 7th and 8th. All notices have met their legally compliant deadline. We're in compliance legally. We've met all of our deadlines. We did post our final agenda. We have a combination of ceremonial, procedural, and educational elements to this first meeting. And today, as I had mentioned, will be an opportunity for a little food for thought around things that we'll talk about on day 2 primarily, which have to do with transition from where we are now to an interstate commission and ultimately standing up the compact of some of the committee activities and structures and operational issues. And I think that one of the advantages of having Rick with us, not only today, but on October 7th and 8th, is that he has the perspective of being here, most recently with the physical therapists, helping them stand up their compact brand new. He's worked with the Interstate Medical Licensure Compact, which is also, it's within its first about year and a half to almost 2 years. And then Rick has worked for a long time with the Nurse Licensure Compact, which is now transitioning to the Enhanced Nurse Licensure Compact. So as you can see, Rick has that experience and perspective to help us get prepared for this meeting and doing our first year of work. So without further ado, Rick, I'll turn it over to you. And again, I'll do my best to catch your questions as they come up or any comments. Rick, go ahead.
I feel a lot like a legal version of an obstetrician because these compacts are sort of like bringing new creatures into the world, new legal persons into the world, and I've helped give birth, so to speak, to the 3 compacts that have been mentioned by Sue, but also before that, I've been through this process with other commissions, at least 3 of which are 50 state commissions, and for which I was involved, as I have been involved with REPLICA, not only in the preparatory drafting of the compact and assisting and answering technical issues as it was shepherded through the legislatures, but also helping stand up the newly formed governmental body, so to speak, that is created by the compact. That's also the subject of some of the material that's in our compact book, which will probably be helpful, and we'll provide some discounts for it when probably, Sue, before the meeting if we can, so that those who might want a legal resource will have it, which is the second edition of our ABA book, The Evolving Law and Use of Interstate Compacts, which was published in its second edition in December of last year. And it has at least an entire chapter, if not more, on organizing the administrative bodies that make compacts work. And certainly this is no exception to the process that's been used in other healthcare professions, as Sue has already made reference. So you're following in the footsteps of other commissions that have already formed that licensed health professionals. So it's not unique and I think you can be reassured that the process has been time tested and should form a reliable basis for unfolding this newly created legal organism called the Interstate Commission for Replica. And we will just spend a few minutes going through the process in a very summary fashion, and then provide time for questions. And I think that's probably the most important part of this, is to make sure any burning issues, if there are some, or issues that aren't so burning but need to be raised, this is the time to do it. So the commission meeting in October will be the formal legal culmination of all of the work that's been done to get this body online, and it will be the first time in which the commission will actually be organized with all of the requisite member states at the table, or at least I think most of them will be there. Are there any absentees, Sue, as far as you know?
Not that I know of. I mean, Delaware's governor just signed the bill last Friday officially, making them a replica state. They are our first replica state that has a bifurcated authority for EMS within that state. There's actually 3 entities that are considered state EMS authorities. So they did amend the bill so that between the 3 of them, they work out who is going to be the delegate or the commissioner. So I spoke with the governor's office on Friday. I'm expecting an update on that shortly. So I believe we'll have Delaware there. I just can't tell you exactly what it's going to be right now.
Well, it's certainly not required that every member state be at the table, but certainly we need a majority to constitute a quorum for the conduct of business. So I have no doubt that you'll have more than a majority, if not the entire membership. And for the first meeting, that is usually desirable. Once this organization finds itself with its representative governing board around the table, we will do what other legal entities do, which is to create the rules and bylaws by which our procedures will be implemented, both in terms of running and administering the organization, and making sure that the legal machinery is in place, so to speak, for the interstate licensure recognition process. Certainly the bylaws, which will be proposed and adopted at this first meeting, will be the first part of that, and will define the procedures that the commission will use in exercising the legal functions that have been entrusted to it under the statutes of the enacting states. These bylaws are very similar to those that have been adopted and are being utilized by the other health professions in their compacts, as well as other compact commissions. Nothing particularly surprising or unusual about them. It provides for the way meetings will be called, the way officers will be elected, the way the business of the organization or the Interstate Commission will be conducted, and defining various committees that will be at the discretion of the governing board or the commission members to create. Typically, compact commissions can operate when they're at single digits or slightly above that, sort of as a committee of the whole. And so it's possible to have meetings and get business done with more or less everybody at the table if you choose to do that. But as this group gets bigger, it will be much more difficult to get everybody together for a meeting, and it will become much less efficient if you attempt to run it with the entire group being called together every time some fairly routine or day-to-day matter has to be decided. So my belief is that you'll find that the bylaws which provide for an executive committee and other committees will be more and more useful as this commission grows in size, and you will rely upon the work of those committees to allow the commission to function without everybody having to be present for every meeting that implements the organic parts of this new commission. So our first meeting, in addition to adopting bylaws and electing officers, one of the most important functions will be to establish those working committees, and probably, in fact, I'm going to recommend that those committees take some time during the time for the meeting, however brief that may be, to assemble themselves and plan some timelines going forward along with the commission. And frankly, again, this will be sort of the same group that will be making these decisions, but I think there probably needs to be a smaller group than all 12 states at the table to meet to propose the prospective rules that will be used to govern this group. And I'll certainly defer to the discretion of the appointed representatives of the states to decide how best to do that. But my recommendation is to keep that group to a smaller number, because it's simply more difficult the more people you have around the table to try to engage in a meaningful dialogue and get everybody together for every meeting that needs to occur, many of which will be electronic or conference calls, some of which will probably inevitably require at least one face-to-face meeting, so that we can get in a room around a slide projector and put these potential rules up on the screen and do some drafting. And that's an established procedure that I think has been used very effectively in the other compacts. I think it's probably important to discuss things like what group will carry on what activities, so that you've got rules being drafted, you've got issues related to technology, so that when the rules are ready to be implemented, you've got a technology capability that's in place and appropriate agreements in place to implement that. Some consideration needs to be given for financial matters going forward. How do we intend to pay for the work of the commission, and are we going to rely exclusively on processing fees that would be in part derived, if not entirely, from licensees? Do we have some grant opportunities that may augment that? Do we have other organizations that are interested stakeholders that will be providing either in-kind or other services? And exactly what will that look like going forward? Sue, what's the next slide? I think
Sure.
we probably need to move to that one.
And Rick, if I may, I noticed that in looking at, spending time looking through the Interstate Medical Licensure Compact and the PT Compact and MIC3, but more so those last two, that there was the committee work was heavy, was very deliberate, and that they took time. And I'll share this with everybody, copies of the minutes, where they really segmented out what belonged to who. They seemed to be very deliberate, so that there was not, they understood there'd be some crossover, but they wanted the missions of the groups to be very clear, especially where a lot of the work was going to be done on the web and remotely.
Yeah, and I think that's a good idea to imitate, Sue. And what I want to avoid doing is suggesting to you that there's any one template that has to be used in order to carry this out. But I think we can learn from the successes as well as the not so successful approaches used in other compact commissions to know what to embrace and what to shy away from in terms of the methodology. And I think you've correctly pointed out that the Military Ed Compact Commission had a very clear mission statement and charge involving each of the committee's work plans, and I think that's an important part of this going forward. You'll see here on the chart that Sue's prepared the rulemaking process that other commissions have followed. I think to be sure that you get these rules promulgated and adopted in a way that meets with the requirements of the compact and have been appropriately vetted by all the commission members is going to certainly be a process of several months. How fast you can do it really depends on how widely cast these rules will be, and certainly deciding the categories of rules in which we need to be active and the priorities of the order in which these rules will be adopted needs to be agreed upon, and I think that will be done that will be one of the many things that will be done at that first meeting. So I am going to rely upon our trustee manager to give us the next slide, and we'll talk more about this process going forward. Certainly a communications and public relations function needs to be managed, and again, I think some of these areas will be handled as a committee of the whole, but I would anticipate that one of the committees that you may subdivide yourselves into would be a management and public relations committee that would be assembled to not only deal with external stakeholders, but perhaps provide training as well as public relations functions to commissioners and staff within the states to understand how this process should work, and to provide continuing training opportunities, materials, modules, and other tools so that you can educate what I'm sure will be in Replica, what it has been in other professions. You have turnover as a fact of life, particularly in state workers, state employment, particularly emergency management, as among others. And I think you have to prepare for the fact that you're going to have turnover not only in your EMS offices, but you will have commissioners that will come and go. Some will serve longer terms than others, and there will be a need for continuing training, as well as communications with the outside world, and to appropriately speak with one voice concerning the function of Replica going forward, both for purposes of the administration of the existing administrative body, as well as the ongoing efforts to educate legislators and other stakeholders in states that want to adopt Replica. And it's my belief that ultimately there is certainly room for every state in the union at the table, although how soon and what priority you give to having all 50 states is probably a matter of discussion and a function of resources, as well as the planning for the commission going forward. And that's probably yet another issue that needs to be discussed. How fast do we think we should grow? How fast do we think we can grow? And what efforts need to be made once this commission is formed to augment and take the lead on those efforts to continue to provide legislative information when states call asking for the model statute and have issues related to how this compact works, and may have the need for both material as well as in-person testimony, and have other questions that will arise as you go forward. Yeah, go ahead.
I might be skipping a little ahead here, but thinking about an executive committee, I noticed, especially with in the early days of the physician compact, that they didn't have an executive director. So they did a lot of the correspondence. The day-to-day correspondence and the day-to-day communication was really handled by the executive committee. Can you talk a little bit about your experience with the different executive committees and the kinds of work that they take on, and maybe where the line gets drawn for what's the whole body's business and what they should be doing daily?
Well, I think your bylaws will spell out the areas in which the executive committee will have managerial authority, and for the most part, under the compact, the executive authority of the commission will be able to act on behalf of the commission with respect to any matters other than amending the compact or engaging in rulemaking. So you're vesting your executive committee with the authority to act for the commission. Having said that, certainly things like budgets are going to need to be approved by the entire commission. The hiring of certainly an executive director can be accomplished largely by the executive committee with the approval of the commission. And I think if there were one area that I believe the medical licensure compact commission would say if they had it to do over again and had the ability to make it happen, they would have had an executive director much earlier. That was a function of both dollars and cents in terms of having the funding available to do that at an earlier date, as well as a perception perhaps in the early part of the activities of the commission that more of these decisions should be made on a group basis by the executive committee. And I think you can develop a balance between those two. Not that the executive director is going to be making independent decisions for the commission, but I think once certain fundamental decisions have been made, I think it's important to get an executive director on board as early as you feasibly can do that to help implement that and allow a central processing of information, communications, administrative activities for the commission itself, flowing through one point of contact, if you will. So I think the executive director is also going to be essentially your national office for purposes of your management going forward. And I think the earlier that you can establish that, the better off you'll be, and the more efficiently and effectively this commission will be able to operate.
Thank you for taking the time to
yeah. And
that kind of, for me.
What's that?
I say thank you for taking the time to split those hairs for me.
I think it's good. And it's sort of segueing into this next slide, which is budgetary and management considerations. Certainly, those issues are among the startup items that have to be on the agenda and need to be decided at an early time. And while I don't know that all of the decisions will be completely finalized at the commission meeting, I think you need to at least have established what the plans are going forward for all of these issues, a database, the initial training of those who are going to help make this happen, how you're going to handle your accounting and human resources functions, and again, as I said, the support for the legislative efforts going forward with new member states. Some of this, I think, probably will be handled on some sort of secretariat basis. I mean, I think in part, Sue, if I'm not overstepping here, I think hasn't NASIMSO been acting as sort of a de facto secretariat for this organization? In terms of website and
no, the website's been funded. So the National Registry of EMTs provided a grant to ASMI to carry out the advocacy and some of the initial commission setup functions. So although NASIMSO does things, contributes things like this webinar that we have today, like I have access to some of the remote tools that they have for their own work, and the registry supplies not only funding but some other remote tools for work. So they're partnerships of sort.
Yeah.
Well, they're clearly partnerships. What am I saying? Yeah, they're clearly partnerships. Each one of them gives something different, but this. I mean, it seems to have worked out, and when there's a need, there's a group that is able to stand up and handle it. And the NASIMSO and the registry have been hand in hand on that level.
Well, exactly, and again, the existing arrangements are what they are. I think the critical distinction here is going to be after October, you actually will have a legal entity known as the Commission that has the authority to make the management decisions as to how this will run going forward. And obviously, there are certain realities that you deal with these issues and these challenges with whatever funds you currently have and whatever organizations have been participating. Hopefully, there will be a continued commitment to take care of these issues going forward, but it'll be the responsibility of the Commission to make sure those relationships are formally correlated with the fact that there's a new commission now that will be acting on behalf of the states with regard to implementation of the compact, as well as helping get new states on board.
So there are two questions, but I do want to make a comment. It's something I noticed in the IMLC, in the Physicians Compact. There was discussion back and forth about the relationship between the Commission and the Federation of State Medical Boards. So they seem to, I don't think struggle is the best way to describe it, but try to define what's the same and what's different. And I think that somewhat connects to what you've just been describing. And that's, again, something I'm happy to share with folks. But we have two questions, and they're ones that either you or I are combined can handle. One is, can you give more details on legislative support resources? So in looking back, in putting together this presentation, talking about this with Rick, these are common themes that when the last three commissions have been stood up have been talked about more than once. So in terms of legislative support, that's the continued advocacy, because there's been heavy emphasis on advocacy to get bills filed, support them while they're going through the chambers, support them in getting governors to sign bills, and then moving on to the next one, and at the same time working to set up the commission. So now there's going to be this opportunity where there's commission work that needs to be done, but I don't think that we can drop support for legislative and advocacy activities, because we're going to want to continue to grow that, or you're going to want to continue to grow as a commission. That's my feeling. So I added this in there because I think from a budgetary perspective, and Rick, I'd be interested to hear what you have to say. What's the balance? How do new commissions with limited resources deal with continuing their advocacy but running their commission?
Not well.
Okay,
so
tell us more.
You're either going to have to get grant funding, or somebody to step up and decide how important this is, and where funding for these activities will come from. Certainly, until you get a licensure process in place and you actually start generating revenue and fees, you can't really fund it on an ongoing basis from those revenues. And so certainly I think that pretty much restricts you to the amount of either grant funding or support that can be derived from interested stakeholders and organizations, including those that have been supporting this to date. And I think your activities will be impaired to the extent you can't fund that as completely as you would like, but it is what it is. I mean, whatever is there to support this effort is going to determine to some extent the success of the ongoing legislative efforts. And I think probably that's going to take a secondary seat to getting the new commission up and running and getting the licensure process started, but it's a very close second to continue the advocacy issues as well. So you're sort of building the airplane while you're flying it. And again, I think this is a form of growing pains. I mean, it's not unusual to have this kind of issue. Frankly, the Medical Licensure Commission has been one of those that has had to broker those issues. And I think each group has its differences in terms of who the supporting cast has been, and hopefully the commissioners can work with the existing efforts that have been made to get this project where it is to continue keeping it on that path.
And there was a second question, just said human resources. Do you mean when we have a staff to deal with? Yes, I mean it is, whether it's one person or we could be so lucky someday to have multiple people in an office, but there are human resources issues, even if you're just dealing with one person, or you contract with an agency who deals with those. So you need more. Basically, you're going to need help. You're going to start small. The commission staff could grow, and there's going to be the needed ability to manage bringing people on, making sure the agreements that are needed are in place, making sure that you're in compliance with all the types of human resources and labor relations laws that labor laws that exist out there, employment laws, for these types of, for any type of organization, but be it here a governmental body. So that's what that reference is.
Yeah, and I think largely we're referring to laying the groundwork for what's to come, because obviously you're not going to hire more than probably an executive director, if that, in the first 6 to 12 months. But it's possible you might. But I think just accommodating the need to have a decision made as to how is it we're going to accomplish things like accounting, finance, human resources, technology, and other management functions. And are we going to do that in-house, so to speak, where we're going to go out on our own and, lease space somewhere, or start, paying accountants and others to do that work? Or are we going to have an outsourced function to some sort of organization that offers secretariat services? I'm not suggesting that this is the answer for this particular group, but I do know that CSG, for example, has had at various times between 3 and 6 compact commissions that have been affiliated organizations with CSG for the purpose of acting as the secretariat for those organizations. And while, again, there are other organizations that do that sort of work as well, I think it's helpful to review what options are available out there and make a decision that's cost effective based on the needs of the organization and the ability of those who are chosen to carry out those functions to do that.
And Rick, just going back a little bit, earlier when we talked about committees, this is kind of skipping ahead but stepping back. A finance or a budget committee, or combination of the two, could be established once bylaws are adopted, by the chairman of the commission, and could have the mission to investigate all of these issues. And on this, everybody, when you look at the second day of your agenda packet, or your agenda, it talks about a management discussion, agreements around the coordinated database. It lays all of those pieces out that are related to what we're talking about today. The idea is to just get some of these perspectives and experience Rick has had, so that you can start thinking about it and bring it to the table for that discussion. And I see another question.
Right, and you may be ready to make those decisions by your meeting in October, but certainly you can at least decide which direction does the majority think ought to be taken, and how will that be implemented, and who's going to implement that going forward.
Well, this might be a question from Joe, because it comes up under me. And Joe, let's see if I can figure this out. Nope, I can't figure it out. Where is it? I lost it. Okay, Joe, if that was you with the question, can you hit the button again? I'll see if I can bring it up, or put it in the chat down bottom so we can all see it. It's doing okay. Open discussion. Rick, I have a question. You talked a little earlier, you made a statement that said there was some experience with things that had not worked. And one of the things I noticed was that for the Interstate Medical Licensure Compact, in their very first meeting, they set an ambitious date and said, within 6 months, we'll be processing licenses. Now, it's a different type of compact than ours is in terms of how they do their business. But I noticed that they drew that back in, and once they realized it looks like they had ahead of them. Is that a good example of something that hasn't worked, making that type of statement and not being able to move in that progression, or can you think of some other things?
Well, I think that is an issue. You want to be sure that you can deliver on the projected date for actually commencing activity, and you risk some damage to your credibility if you don't. However, certainly, since the medical compact was one in which it wasn't just a recognition of a license from another state, it was a separate license that was being issued in each and every state. And they also had some issues that were not expected concerning criminal background checks, which were required to be implemented from day one. And so, unlike the compact that REPLICA has adopted, as well as physical therapy there was not a grace period within which some of those issues could be brokered. So I think that contributed to some unforeseen delays. And frankly, just being sure that funding was there to make sure this effort was appropriately implemented was a concern, and that was alleviated. And I think they're on firm ground now, but I'm not sure that you can take anything away from that other than there are always unforeseen circumstances that could arise. So, you know, the old saw about best laid plans have a way of not coming to fruition, but you do the best you can. And the good news is I think that did not stop the process from happening, and medical licenses are being regularly issued by the medical licensure compact, and they continue to increase in numbers, and I think they're handling it in an incredible way.
They are. Great, thanks. I have a question, Rick. This is in the first 6 months. What would you expect the leadership of the commission needing to spend time-wise on setting up the commission?
You mean implementing it after the first meeting?
Yes, that's what it appears. So thinking 6 months out, how's wisest use of time for the leadership?
Yeah, I think assuming you have a well-planned set of target dates for things like meeting of the Rules Committee and any other committees that are established to cement the contractual relationships with things like your technology system, perhaps the hiring of at least an executive director and so on and so forth. I think 6 months is about right, and you can probably do it a little quicker than that, but I think it would be unrealistic to assume that it wasn't going to be closer to 6 months than shorter time period than that.
Okay. And I'm actually going to go through and just unmute everybody because it's a small group that's on this call. So if there's any free-flowing discussion, we can just start to have it. I'm actually not going to unmute myself on my other computer because that'll cause havoc. Unmute Gary Brown. Yep, that's not working. Nope. There's the feedback. Okay. It's a little better now. Okay. Everybody unmuted. Let's see, I have a question from Dia. Yep, I already took care of that. I have a question from myself, which again I think is Joe Schmieder. Let's see. Question. Nope, I can't see any other questions there. Yeah, so I'm actually going to put everybody back on mute because that's not working. Sorry about that. Any other questions?
That was thrilling.
I know. Sorry about that. I'm trying to have two computers close together to do this.
Let me just reassure you as a group that I think the planning for this meeting in October has been well done, and I think you're pretty much on target with what needs to have been done at this point. So I mean I don't see any areas where I think you're falling short at this point, and I think again the only thing that's going to limit our ability to accomplish everything is the amount of time that people have to be able to commit to this, and the resources that can be identified to keep those available in as large enough proportions as the group thinks is required to meet the time deadlines that you're going to set for yourselves. And naturally, you're just going to have to balance that on sort of a cost-benefit basis, the way any responsible organization would operate. And I think I think that's the way to go, and you look to be in pretty good shape to me.
And Rick, is it fair to say that, going back to the budgetary considerations, that again, it seemed to be a theme between, a few of these compacts that have started up in the last few years? Is it fair to say that you can establish what the items are that you're going to need to fund, but you don't need to have an answer that very first meeting? That you've got time and you're going to have to put the effort into sorting that out.
Yeah, I believe that's a true statement, but I think you have to be prepared that you're not going to achieve your targets as quickly, simply because you don't have the resources to get there. And I think the compacts that have been most successful on the fastest track have been those that have had either grant funding or could quickly establish a funding mechanism within the compact, whether it's through fees or assessments or otherwise, to get the show on the road. So, again, I don't think you have to have every item identified as where the dollar is coming from for every single thing that's going to be done, but I think you need to devote as much attention as you possibly can to make sure that all the resources that you can possibly identify are quickly being sought after and arranged.
Okay, fair enough. Any other questions or comments? Rick, I appreciate the time. I appreciate all of the time that you give us. And we're just starting to wind down here. I wondered if you would take a moment to reflect on our conversation at the Department of Defense last week. And they told, I spoke with Marcus after I left, and he said that they've chosen 4 compacts to support. Can you talk a little bit about what those regional reps can do or would do as far as supporting a compact like REPLICA, which is one of the 4 they've chosen?
Yes, the Department of Defense worked very closely with the Council of State Governments, and I was part of that effort to establish what is now known as the Interstate Commission for Educational Opportunity for Military Children, which administers a 50-state compact in which military members who are deployed or on active duty, when they move from one public school district in one state to a public school district in another state, have a legal regime in the form of the compact statute that requires certain accommodations to be made for the children of those families in grades K through 12 to aid their transition so that they graduate on time and can stay in school with their peers, and that things like, California history that wasn't taken when you move, or that was taken before you moved to Maryland, and then you can't meet the requirement there because you didn't have their history course, or some type of literature or math requirement is required in the new state and wasn't in the previous state. I mean, things like that are required to be dealt with in a reasonable manner so that kids aren't disrupted in the pursuit of their education. And DOD was assisted in providing grant funding to get that online, and they helped with the legislative effort by using liaisons that are located in each region of the country, whose sole responsibility is to assist in providing information to states about priorities for military families, military members and their families and their spouses, and assisting and advocating legislative solutions that aid those family members. And certainly they perceive that occupational licensure compacts, which facilitate license portability quickly across state lines, is advantageous for military members and particularly their spouses. And they were very supportive of not just EMS, but the physical therapy compact, the medical licensure compact, the nursing compact, and all of the occupational compacts as a way of accomplishing those objectives of supporting military families. Now, I can't speak for the DOD, and I don't know what their funding situation is, but I certainly think it would be a wise thing to stay in touch with that office of the Department of State liaisons and the head of that department, who Sue and I both met with and presented to the regional liaisons for DOD, that certainly could be a potential, certainly a supporter of the legislation. They want this to be part of their package of bills that they want to emphasize and advocate for as assisting military families and particularly spouses. And I think seeking their support would certainly be consistent with that mission.
Sounds good. Thank you for the overview. It was a great meeting, and one of the things Marcus and I talked about on the way out. First of all, getting into the Mark Center in Alexandria, Virginia, is, I hear it's harder to get into than the Pentagon. It was unbelievable. But
yeah, well, I've been to the Pentagon twice, and it actually is harder to get into than the Pentagon. I mean, I got in Pentagon in about 10 minutes. It took me half an hour both times to get into the Mark Center Fortress.
I was sitting in a waiting room, texting Rick, please, somebody help me. But I got in. Marcus was talking about setting forward. They regularly meet on the phone from the different regions of the country. So we're going to participate in some of those calls, especially around strategy. They're very interested to know what states we're in, what type of work that we're doing, and how they can support us there. And there, as Rick said, there may be some other opportunities as well. So that was a really promising partnership to tap into. And I see I think a question from Scott Winston from Virginia. Yeah, there are any So Scott Winston from Virginia wants to know: are there any arrangements that should be avoided when identifying a source of funding to operate the commission?
Well, we don't have a conflict of interest policy that's been formally adopted, but certainly the same sort of care should be exercised in forming those relationships as with any other organization, particularly when it's governmental in nature. And that would be to avoid any quid pro quos or promises of special benefits or other favors in exchange for support. On the other hand, just because it's a private organization as opposed to a governmental organization, certainly private not-for-profit organizations that regularly support these kinds of activities would be permissible sources, in my opinion, for funding. And it just, I think it's just important for public perception and otherwise to make sure that you've vetted those potential grant proposals with care, and you've thought through the nature of the relationship that's formed. And I don't think you have to be overly concerned, but you just need to exercise a reasonable amount of care in reviewing those sorts of proposals. So I don't think there's a wholesale ban on some sort of support just because it's from a private, not-for-profit organization, but I think you need to have some sort of vetting process that's in place to avoid any potential conflicts.
Okay. So we're within the last few minutes of our time. And again, I appreciate everyone's flexibility with some of the changes in schedules to get us here today. This is recorded. It will be available in Basecamp and on YouTube on our website. Any other questions for Rick while we have him? And if there aren't, Rick will be seeing you on October 7th. And I'm sure there'll be a lot more questions, but this was a great teaser or primer to get us to get the juices flowing for folks to come prepared to talk about these really important issues in starting up a commission.
Well, it's been my pleasure, Sue. Just let me know how I can help.
Oh, thank you. It's always a pleasure. And I'm going to end the call now. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day. Let's see, sharing.